Hey guys, it's Paul, combat veteran, MMA fighter, YouTuber, and today we are checking out Luetin's most popular video of all time, bar none. This is The Emperor of Man, The Rise of Humanity, Part 1. This is an hour and a half long, so this is going to be in multiple parts, but we are going to get into it. But before we get started, be sure check out the merch store, link is down below, and check out the second channel where I do reactions to more than just Warhammer, lots of video games and other stuff out there. Alright, having done that, let's get into it. The grim darkness of the far future is... there's not only war. There's brief respites between wars. The dramatic unveiling of...
There once was a man born in a forgotten time, created by a force of unknown origin. He would cross the ages knowing his one purpose, to lead humanity as the greatest empire in the galaxy. The Imperium of Man. In this time, he would be known by only one name: the Emperor of Mankind.
Appreciate the dramatic lens flare. Can always count on Luetin for some high drama in his videos. And Warhammer 40k is pretty dramatic, you know? But when I look at the Emperor, man, it's just like the ego is just so big. Like, I'd be curious to know, like, how much of the Emperor is human and how much is godlike? I guess that's a question we all have to ask,
This
right?
is Luetin. I must first apologise for the length of time since the last project. The simplest explanation is it took me a long time to compile amid many other things going on for me. So we now move on from the Eldar history and wade into one of the most important and complicated narratives in the universe of the 41st millennium. It is, of course, the rise of humanity and the Imperium. In the dark, never-ceasing war that is the future, humans have risen to control and maintain a galaxy-spanning empire whose official title is the Imperium of Mankind. The Imperium is the largest and most powerful political entity in the galaxy. It has been established for a period of some 10,000 years up to its present date in the age of Warhammer 40k. The lore and scripture around this period is massive. Despite this daunting task though, I've decided to interpret it in one piece chronologically, splitting it into chapters so as to best enable you guys to get an understanding and a grasp of what it is all about. This is the third video in my Warhammer 40,000 lore series, and it seeks to create a foundation for all of the further videos which talk about the Imperium of Man.
Man, Luetin, you can never say that he doesn't have ambition.
The Imperium of Man consists of the planets, systems and forces throughout the galaxy which contain Imperial citizens and their derivatives. Not all humans are universally members of the Imperium though, and as you would expect, there are rogue traders and those who choose to live on the legal fringes of the society. The single most important figure within the Imperium is the aforementioned founder, saviour and ruler of this empire, known as the Emperor of Mankind. He formed the Imperium some 10,000 years previous to the current established date in the universe of Warhammer 40,000 at the end of the 30th millennium. This occurred following an especially brutal period of societal disintegration during the last days of the Age of Strife. In this video, I'll outline the political state that is the Imperium, as well as the history behind how humanity reached this point in the far future. As with anything though, the complexity and depth of the lore means I can't cover it in its fleshed entirety, so some tangents are going to have to remain for future videos, but I do my best to cover as much as possible which is relevant. The Emperor of Man sits as an extremely powerful figure within the Imperium. Make no mistake, he is the centre of humanity in the 41st millennium. So powerful a humanoid, he was arguably barely human to begin with, and he continues to protect mankind after his mortal wounding during the final battles of a period known as the Horus Heresy. Were it not for his ever-present psychic voice reaching out, searching, protecting and planning, then the Imperium of Man would undoubtedly fall back into dark oblivion, and perhaps the light would be extinguished permanently. The Emperor was injured so badly after the heresy that he now exists only as a husk of a man within a stasis chamber called the Golden Throne. This allows him to live on eternally as he has done for some past 10,000 years, whilst continually guiding mankind through psychic whispers. The only catch with this is thousands of psykers are sacrificed every day using their essence and psychic power to keep him alive, as he is heavily protected and attended to back on the ancient homeworld of legend, Terra, or Old Earth. The Imperium of Man in the wider galaxy.
Yeah, some of those pictures of like the Emperor on the Golden Throne, like some are kind of dramatic, but yeah, I appreciate the ones that really capture just how much of a scarcely alive corpse he is. I mean, you know, we can, with modern technology, keep a person who is otherwise brain dead alive for a long time, but usually not to their natural lifespan. Actually, what frequently kills them are things like bed sores and the infections that come from just being static in a fixed position for a long, long time. You know, you don't appreciate sometimes as a person who's like, oh, what's the harm in lying down? But when you talk about lying down for months and months on end, you start to see these really, really pretty dangerous ill effects.
Galaxy now consists of many systems, planets, and trillions of citizens. All the while, the Imperial military and the many administrators of mankind, all of whom swear allegiance to the Emperor, all stand together against the nightmares of the galaxy to form what is humanity in the darkest of futures. Now, we know that in this future we have access to highly advanced technology and face many voracious enemies wielding our own forces to then counter them. The important question in understanding the Imperium is, how did we get to this time? And to understand this, we need to look back at the extensive and dark history of humanity. There is a small clue as to the way in which the people that constitute humanity in the 41st millennium view their past. That is, the imperial two-headed eagle, the crest of the Imperium. It stands with its two heads, but with one eye closed. Blind, or perhaps refusing to see the past. The other eye is open, looking to the future. The logic being that the past of humanity is too painful or dangerous to look back on, so we look forward, striving to be stronger and more powerful, as we have done for thousands of years.
Yeah, this is sort of an interesting sense of... Well, it's interesting because there's certainly a lot of ideological weight behind this idea, right? The traditional... So when we talk about ideologies, right, on the far right spectrum is going to be what's called reactionary. Reactionary are people who generally reject much of modernity, whether that's modern values, modern technology, modern lifestyles, and they aspire to actually see humanity regress. Then you have conservatives. Conservatives generally are oriented towards resisting societal change, or rather changing in a way that is perhaps slower or gradual or less dynamic than some want. Then you have what's usually considered like liberals or leftist, or the term is, again, in modern parlance, we generally use liberals as center left. Those are people that want to adopt proximate, right, who want to see society make incremental changes that are not fundamentally disruptive to the system. And then to their left are progressives, who see that the system as being largely corrupted or heavily in need of reform, and do not shy away from their desire to introduce reforms that will change fundamental aspects of the social fabric or social change. Obviously, in history, right, you see, unfortunately, those two fringes, right, at times they become necessary for example, after the First World War, right, before World War I, most of Europe was under a monarchy, a king with actual power who actually ruled over almost always his people. And by the time World War II ended, right, by the, late 20s, early 30s, you actually saw a large number of democratic institutions, versions of electoral politics in many, many European countries that had been absolute monarchies. And again, if you asked someone in 1898 about overthrowing the king and installing an electoral system of government, they would have been considered a radical. But the truth is that system, right, that old school great power politics, multipolar system, had driven by individual egos and individual decision makers, that collapsed under the weight of the First World War. And what emerged was something a little more democratic, a little more changed, right? You had this idea that every single person in these countries now had a civic engagement mandate, a mandate to go and vote, a mandate to have a say in how they were governed, right? This was an injection into civic life that almost everyone experienced. That was a huge radical shift. And now we look back and we don't think of it that way, but at the time that was a progressive movement, right? On the other side of the coin, you have things like the Iranian Revolution, right? This was a rejection of modernity by, it was actually a lot of university students at the time, but you also see this in things like the Japanese, I want to say the Meiji Restoration, I think. But when Japan basically closed itself off from the world and actually banned the use of firearms in combat and really tried to take their society back to before the rise of what they saw as society-changing weapons like firearms. So, again, it's interesting to see that throughout history, right, you end up with these times where the relationship between society and its past get renegotiated, and then you have long stretches where change is either incremental in the conservative sense, right, with very, 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 very little change or only change that's kind of forced upon it, or you have the liberal interpretation, which is gradual change while shoring up the fundamental components of existing systems. And bear in mind, I'm using some examples here, but there's a lot of examples. Look at like Syria, right, or Libya. There's examples where radical change took place and there was a lot of people with visions of how to remake that country, but the result of those visions was not a new order, but in fact, in both cases, a bloody and vicious civil war, right, a sort of anarchy.
There are distinct ages of humanity's histories, and these tell the story of how we reached the time of the Imperium. 1 millennium equals 1,000 years. The Imperium has now been established for 10 millennia or 10,000 years. Humanity has existed for roughly 41,000 years.
I mean, what's incredible is that from basically the year 10,000 to today, look at how much, or from the year 8,000 to today, look at how much has changed, right? The definition of what it means to be a person is almost unrecognizable. And so that's why I think it's almost comical to think that you could have 10,000 years of any persistent system just because of the nature of human beings and the nature of their reimagining of things. There's also a scale problem, right? When you have only, when all of humanity is maybe 500,000 people, i.e. like the Neolithic era, there's just not a lot of change because there's not a lot of people to enact change and not a lot of relationships among people. But as the number of people increase, you naturally start to see more and more ideas, more and more relationships, more and more dynamics play out in this larger and larger population. And again, when you're talking about trillions and trillions of people, the chances that you would see a persistent governance system, that just so happens to last, I'm going to say 100 times longer than the next longest serving system government, right? Or power or polity. It's almost impossible, right? Barring some sort of rule by force. which, under the Emperor of Man, perhaps an eternally living god could enforce a 10,000 year polity ruling, but other than that, not really.
This timeline demonstrates the ages of man through this period, from our ancient history through to the age of the Imperium. We have the ancient history, the age of terror, the golden age of technology or the dark age of technology, the age of strife, the unification wars, the Great Crusade and the fall of the Eldar, the Horus Heresy and the Great Scouring, followed by the final age of Imperium of Man.
Ancient history. That's me!
The ancient history tells of the dawn of mankind, but this period is largely one of animalistic evolution. The most significant event occurs around 7000 BC. This event marks the birth of the humanoid, who would become the Emperor of Mankind. His origins are something of a heated debate among the 40k community. There are several theories around this, and it's important to note that something I rarely see stated on forums or discussions around the origins of the Emperor is that quite simply no one knows the origins of the Emperor. It's all just speculation. Simply because one theory has had a vague reference at one time or another does not make it gospel. In fact, as I've repeated before, the crux of the matter with imperial history and lore in general is that very little should ever be considered official or canon. Such is the state of the loss of history, misinformation, and suppression of facts within the 40k universe. So essentially, the correct version is the version you want to believe. In a universe where history is stored over thousands of years and in times of unimaginable devastation.
Yeah, perhaps I will share with you my theory on the Emperor of Man, but I'm more curious to hear what Luetin has to say. But if you have a theory on who the Emperor of Man is, right, that maybe goes against canon, definitely let me know in those comments.
And strife, it's unlikely something could be considered a cold, hard fact, especially when you're talking about events that happened in ancient history in an age where accurate recording of information seems unlikely or even impossible to have survived. The first version of these events is the often widely accepted background, which states that in the ancient times, some humans carried a natural affinity or awareness of the warp. These were the earliest psykers. They would be village shamans or witch doctors in ancient communities. Their premonitions led them to understand that in the future, mankind would face the darkest of times. Their decided course of action would be to commit ritual suicide en masse, returning their souls and essence to the warp to then coalesce and be reborn as one supremely powerful psychic being. This being would then spend the future millennia living a Highlander-like existence, transitioning from identity to identity, sometimes taking on famous leaders in history to steer humanity in the right direction.
Okay, so here is the thing. I've talked about this in my previous video about why there were no female Space Marines. And that is basically that when you are born, right, and you're stuck being a person, we're going to assume that the Emperor is highly intelligent, highly capable, but not fundamentally different from a human being. And when you are born and raised in a society, right, you only get one childhood, and even for someone like the Emperor, that childhood is a fixed period of time, right? The Emperor probably reached the age of 30 and looked like a 30-year-old human-ish. And then over time, right, it remained as an adult, as a perpetual. And so when you're a child, right, there are formative ideas about the world that you shape and internalize. And everything that you see is a version of that, right? The things that you experience as a child are sort of your version of true north. That's one of the reasons that a lot of people that grow up in, for example, abusive households seek out abusive relationships and actually will sometimes reject loving relationships because there's something underneath it that feels right. It feels normal to be treated in a bad way. And that's because of your childhood, right? And so when the Emperor was born and raised in the year 7000 BC, you have to think this was the early Neolithic era. Humanity had just discovered farming. And slowly, what used to be communities of hunter-gatherers were transitioning to become static farmers. And what's happened to humanity was actually, in some ways good, in some ways bad. The calories each human being ate increased. The fertility rate, the number of children, number of live births per woman, increased a lot, up to almost between 6 and 7 live births per woman. But the health of humanity and the mortality actually dropped because their diets went from an extensive, varied diet of fruits, vegetables, nuts, and meats, right, hunting and gathering. It was replaced with heavily and largely cultivated grain with a small addition of meat if it could be found or hunted, or of course fish. This much unhealthier diet was terrible actually for human beings in their overall health. And so you started to see these widespread health problems. You started to see parasites. Also, you started to see, because there were so many human beings living in villages, tight villages, sometimes numbering in the thousands, that communicable diseases became rampant, right? They would sweep through huge swaths of the population. And I think for someone like the emperor, being raised in this environment, right, that was actually very different from what humanity was evolved to thrive in, it would have probably affected his perception heavily. And we sort of see that, right? We see that humanity is viewed as almost having to produce new generations of adults to be fed into a meat grinder that kills them kind of en masse, not unlike the plague, disease, and malnutrition of the Neolithic world. Again, around a third of children would just die in the Neolithic Earth, or would not make it to adulthood, right? So, if you're the Emperor of Man, I think everything he does seems to be viewed in that way. It explains his love of the warrior king as a concept. It explains his love of using human beings as essentially, through sufficient reproduction, humanity can fight off the things that try to claw it away. Just like you can offset the effects of disease through constantly having more children, right? So anyway, view the Emperor's actions through that lens, and I'm curious to see how it shakes out.
And then upon reaching the Age of Strife, he would step into the Four to become the supreme leader of all humanity and unite us again throughout the galaxy. Now, some people take this as the most canon version of the Emperor's origin, but there are various others, including the one that I actually personally subscribe to. The shaman story is all very well and good, but it leaves me with some questions. For example, if these shaman were some of the earliest humans with only a vague awareness of the warp, how could they have such powerful precognition to foresee the need to create such a super being? In addition to that, if they were truly the earliest stowings of psychos for humanity, then surely they would not have been especially powerful, and even with their powers combined, how could they summon humanity's greatest champion? No, not Captain Planet. So, those two things stand out for me. Also, their plan to commit mass suicide and then hope that they would all be reborn together seems pretty spurious. It seems to tick the boxes from an okay, I guess that's possible point of view, but it just doesn't make sense beyond that.
Well, we've discussed this. The warp is the thing that lets you get away with anything in Warhammer 40k.
Another theory is that the Emperor was in fact one of the Old Ones, who you will remember were one of the most ancient super beings who created the Eldar, the Orcs, and even humanity. Yes, really. Go and look it up for those naysayers who think that they did not. This theory, again, at first is captivating, until you start to think about it more. And then you realise it doesn't really make any sense. The Old Ones were, as far as we are informed, not shapeshifters, but creatures of light and dark. There was a statement to the fact that just a single Old One escaped the brutal genocide of their race, but then was eventually killed at the birth of Slanesh when the Eldar fell. If the Emperor was some other escaped Old One, it doesn't make logical sense that they would choose one race and then ultimately lead it, although I suppose, devil's advocate, who's to say what would be going in the mind of this Old One after his entire race was extinguished? Maybe it had a crisis of conscience, anything.
I mean, look, humanity became the dominant power in the galaxy, so if the Old Ones did indeed pick humanity, they picked a winning horse. They picked a horse with, a strong staying power and the ability to persist for, a comparatively long time, though not that long in the grand scheme of, say, the Old One, right? Something that a creature that lasted millions of years, right? Lasting a few, a million or a few 100,000 really doesn't count for much.
Anything, I guess, is possible. And then not to mention also the fact that the Emperor would lead humanity to wage war on pretty much every other alien race, which wouldn't really serve any purpose within the context of an Old One's mission statement. They were originally life givers. They seeded planets with life to, create new races in the universe.
Yeah, but again, look, the orcs will self-destruct, and the Tyranids will self-destruct. The Eldar feed the warp, feed the shit out of the warp, and, maybe the Old Ones are just like, maybe this particular Old One, right? All the Old Ones were life givers, but maybe this particular Old One was kind of an asshole. Maybe he thought seeding this additional broken, ineffective life throughout the galaxy was a mistake. And I could definitely see that, right? You're an Old One, your colleagues are making all these bizarre creatures, and it makes the Eldar who seek constant new experiences, and you accidentally create a horrible god committed to torturing them. You have the orcs that can only really truly be happy when they're killing, and you have humanity who lead short, painful lives fraught with emotion at the best of times, and lead short, painful lives and gruesome, grotesque deaths in the worst. So I could definitely see that there would be at least one Old One who would go, this was a mistake, creating this barely sentient life, right? Life of these individual 180-pound things, 180 to 500-pound thing that are like sentient, but still totally constrained by their own fleshy bodies, right? And yeah, I would absolutely see an Old One going, this is nonsense. This was a tremendous mistake, and we need to do everything we can to just wipe the slate clean. And if we make future living things, we will bring them up as sentient gods, right? An entire self-aware planet, for example.
And again, unless it had
maybe that's the logic. Maybe that's actually the right answer.
Simply lost the plot and was operating on his own sort of mission plan. There are some things that do fit this theory though, such as Old Ones being very powerful psychic creatures. They had extended precognition, they had very extensive, almost immortal long life, and they would have the ability to genetically manipulate humans. But all of this seems very soft and is only plausible at best. For me, this theory just doesn't really fit. So the last theory, and the one that I personally believe, is that the Emperor was neither the creation of some bizarre suicide pact or an Old One, rather something in between. It's fair to say that in any ancient history nothing is quite as it's written, and that some reading between the lines is necessary. The most ancient of history available hints that the last remaining Old One floated around the galaxy, meddling and dabbling and trying to have some last impact on the worlds which they felt they had failed and left their race completely annihilated. We know that the Old Ones were capable of creating beings of immense psychic power. This is how the ancient Eldar defeated the Necrons and Satan, who were, let's not forget, gods capable of devouring stars. So the theory I stand by is that a fragmented remaining Old One drifted around the galaxy until he was struck by a precognition so terrible that he had no choice but to resolve becoming involved. It could be that he saw the vision of the Eldar fall or the rise of chaos. Either way, he knew that the Eldar were by now far too arrogant to accept any help and would be of no use, remembering that the Eldar had turned their backs on the Old Ones long ago. The Orcs, who were also an Old One's creation, they were too crass and mindless for such preparation. Instead, he would turn to the weak humans. Weak, but with great potential. And so he would decide on forming a divine creature, a humanoid of the most immense power, but birthed in such a way that he would not allow those humans would not immediately view him as a god, but as a man, to be not worshipped, but instill a sense of power, of awe, of destiny. There are other clues as well. Apparently, further along in Earth's ancient history, a creature crashed to Earth who had an appearance we would describe as a dragon. It would seem, though, that this dragon was in fact a small fragment of the star gods, the Satan, who had been destroyed thousands of light years away by the Necrons. even a tiny fragment of these most powerful beings would be beyond the means of even the most powerful humans to contain. The future Emperor in this time wounded this creature and then apparently took it to Mars. I'm not sure how, but there it lay imprisoned within the planet. The final chapter of that story, that's one for another.
Yeah, listen, I gotta tell you, when the ruler of a country who ascribes himself as divine, and North Korea is the best example, when they start spewing these stories that get preposterous, you should just discount them, honestly. This is common for almost every leader, right? And they all do it to some degree, right? Look, every American politician in the modern era releases some sanitized biography in which they are include some allusions that have them like blessed by God or like charmed by fate, and it was then that I met that by some miracle I got into Harvard Law. By some miracle I won my state election. It was like the universe had told me the sign, right? Just as I quit my job as a lobbyist, my friend called me and said, Paul, you should become a senator, right? There's always that little spark of just enough to make you think that there's some sort of universal sacred anointing going on with your politician, and their biography gets sanitized and their stories get told in the most true but the most bombastic way possible, right? And that's in an electoral democracy where people can fact check. When they can't, you end up with the North Korean type situation where the dear leader was born atop a sacred mountain when a golden eagle landed upon the house of his birth, and a great star shined bright, and there emerged the leader, right, where he gave his mom a great high five and congratulated her on birthing the god king of the world, right? These preposterous stories are, and you can look it up. Look up the North Korean leader mythos, and you'll see what I'm talking about. It's over the top, right? Deliberately so. And that is, of course, to instill the same idea that the imperium seems to have, which is no reasonable person would engage in rebellion against an actual god. No one would engage in rebellion against a person that they were reasonably certain was a god, right? What sort of maniac would rebel against a living god? No one. So the fact that it sort of serves the emperor's interest for him to have all these stories and rumors about his godhood actually, to me, sort of indicates that, yeah, the emperor may just have made all these up.
The day. Still though, this helps to secure the idea that no mere reincarnation of a few shaman could produce such or perform such a task. Could an old one? Perhaps, but given the other evidence I would still discount it. But a perfectly designed humanoid of godlike form created by an old one who would know a most powerful psychic being was needed to counter not just the future darkness of man, but to face again the Satan and the day of reckoning when the Necrons would rise again. This seems for me the most logical and plausible of origins. The truth, though, is that we cannot know the origin of the Emperor unless some definitive tome is discovered which provides secure evidence as to such, so we are left to speculate until then. One thing that is certain, though, is that the Emperor was a human and holds godlike psychic power. He was within humanity throughout all of history, learning, sometimes guiding, mostly sitting in the shadows, until he was needed to take a course of action that would lead us into the age of the Imperium. The last point worthy of mention is that the Emperor of Man would enforce a strictly secular society. In the early days of the Imperium, this would then enable humanity would identify with him as a man and not as a god. They wouldn't project any religious connotations onto him. Also, because throughout the thousands...
Still bothered by the fact that he does so much to radiate godhood, and yet he doesn't want that. You would be more likely to dress and look like a regular person. That's much more likely to have people convinced that you're not a god.
Thousands of years he spent on Earth, he would see the terrible devastation and fragmentation organized religion could cause. He believed that humanity could only achieve its full potential in a strictly secular state. However, even in the crusading period where the emperor would reunite the lost colonies of man, some people began to spread rumours that he was more than just a powerful man. These beliefs would run so strong it would even question some Astartes to the faith, such as Battle Captain Nathaniel Garrow, one of my favourite characters in the 40k and one of the few Space Marines from the Death Guard chapter not to be corrupted by chaos. Some citizens of the Imperium consider the Emperor's stance on faith even a test so as to distinguish those who can see the whole of the truth, that he is in fact the one true God of mankind.
I mean, that's objectively correct, right? He is the only divine being who defends and represents humanity. So, in that sense, yeah, the imperial cult people just figured it out, right? It's the emperor who was perpetrating the lie. So, guys, let's see. Are we done? Yeah, we are gonna pause it right there for now, right? This is awesome. I'm so excited to get into this. The Emperor of Man. This is the definitive lore video on the definitive character in the Warhammer 40k universe. I'm so excited. I hope you guys are too. Be sure to check out the merch store, the other channel, the Instagram, the Twitch stream, and all the rest of it. And until next time, I will see you guys later.